from the point where we left on page 89 in my edition. So Dryden was discussing Ben Jonson after having discussed Beaumont and Fletcher. So we begin from the passage on Jonson, which is line 1636. As for Jonson, to whose character I am now arrived, if we look upon him while he was himself, for his last plays were but his dotage, I think him the most learned and judicious writer which any theatre ever had. So Dryden says that when Jonson was in his prime, then his works were wonderful, they were great, but in his old age his works were not that so fine. So he says that he is the most learned and most judicious writer or dramatist. He was a man, he was the most severe judge of himself as well as others. One cannot say he wanted wit, but rather that he was frugal of it, which means that he used wit frugally, not very frequently. And he was a great judge of other writers. In his works you find little to retrench or alter, which means that he was a perfectionist in his writing. Wit and language and humour also in some measure we had before him, but something of art was wanting to the drama till he came. So the use of humour or wit was there even before Jonson, but Jonson gave an artistic shape to drama. As he was being a neoclassical writer, he was very well aware of form. He managed his strength to more advantage than any who preceded him. You seldom find him making love in any of his scenes or endeavouring to move the passions. His genius was too sullen and saturnine to do it gracefully, especially when he knew he came after those who had performed both to such an height. So he was not a great writer of romantic drama. Actually, Jonson, we distinguish Jonson as a classicist, and we call Shakespeare and other writers like Beaumont and Fletcher as romantic dramatists. Therefore, Jonson's genius was very different, as Dryden says. He could not portray the passion of love so well, particularly in comparison to his contemporaries. He did not stand up to the mark in the matter of romantic exposition of romantic scenes. Humour was his proper sphere, and in that he delighted most to represent mechanic people. So he was a writer of comedy and he excelled in humour, but he mostly represented mechanic people in the sense that he represented type characters. He was deeply conversant in the ancients, both Greek and Latin, and he borrowed boldly from them. There is scarce a poet or historian among the Roman authors of those times whom he has not translated in Sejanus and Catiline. So Dryden comments on Jonson that he borrowed from the classical writers very boldly, but he has done his robberies so openly that one may see he fears not to be taxed by any law. He invades authors like a monarch, and what would be theft in other poets is only victory in him. So his borrowings from classical writers was open, and nobody would blame him for borrowing from these writers. Now I discussed this earlier that in Jonson's time the idea of individual genius was not important, was not there, but the classical idea was of imitation. In the Renaissance, the idea of imitation was very important, imitation of classical writers, Greek and Roman writers, and therefore when a writer imitated such classical writers, he would expect his readers to identify, to recognize the borrowings. Therefore, the borrowings were not theft, or they were not any indication of the writer's poverty of imagination, but they indicated that the writer followed the model of imitation very thoroughly. With the spoils of these writers, he so represents old Rome to us in its rites, ceremonies and customs, that if one of their poets had written either of his tragedies, we had seen less of it than in him. Which means that he excelled even the Roman dramatists in the depiction of Roman culture, civilization. Particularly, Dryden has in mind the two tragedies by Ben Jonson, Sejanus and Catiline, which are on Roman themes. Shakespeare also has his Roman plays, but they are very unlike Jonson's. If there was any fault in his language, it was that he weaved it too closely and laboriously, in his comedies especially. Perhaps too he did a little too much Romanize our tongue, leaving the words which he translated almost as much Latin as he found them. So while he was borrowing from the Roman writers, he was translating them in English, but his language is very Latinate, according to Dryden, which is a weakness of most classical writers who are erudite. So that is the case with John Milton also. So these writers, they are so much influenced by Greek and Roman writings that in their writings we find the classical stuff. If I would compare him with Shakespeare, before that, wherein though he learnedly followed their language, he did not enough comply with the idiom of ours. That is, his translation of Latin phrases was poor in the sense that he literally translated them, did not follow the English idiom. Then Dryden compares Shakespeare with Jonson. If I would compare him with Shakespeare, I must acknowledge him the more correct poet, but Shakespeare the greater wit. So wit here stands for power of imagination. So as I told you that in the 17th and 18th centuries, the word wit was used in a number of senses. Sometimes it meant linguistic puns, at other times it meant repartee, at other times it meant imagination or intelligence. So here Dryden praises Shakespeare for his wit, means his imagination, even though Jonson was more correct. That is, he followed the rules of writing plays more thoroughly than Shakespeare. Shakespeare was the Homer, or father of our dramatic poets. Jonson was the Virgil, the pattern of elaborate writing. So the classicists who read Homer and Virgil, they find that Homer is not so refined as Virgil. Though Homer is full of imagination, he is the original source of epic poetry in Greek. But Virgil, who imitates Homer and writes in Latin, Virgil's language is much more refined than that of Homer. But he is elaborate, but he does not have the same kind of authenticity of feeling as in Homer. So Dryden compares Jonson to Homer, Jonson to Virgil, because Jonson is more refined and writes in a more elaborate way, and he compares Shakespeare to Homer because of his authenticity of feeling that he conveys through his representations. To conclude of him, as he has given us the most correct plays, so in the precepts which he has laid down in his discoveries, we have as many and profitable rules for perfecting the stage as anywhere which the French can furnish us. Johnson has a book called Timber or Discoveries, which is a book of theory, and Dryden praises him, saying that he contributed by writing a number of good plays, but he also contributed to precepts or theory in his book Discoveries, which we cannot say of Shakespeare. Shakespeare did not write any book of theory. Having thus spoken of the author, I proceed to the examination of his comedy, The Silent Woman. So the debate or the dialogue between the four friends principally comes to an end here, and this last section of Neander's speech is particularly interesting and important insofar as it gives us an estimate or a judgment on Beaumont, Fletcher, Shakespeare and Johnson. Then The Silent Woman or Epicene was a comedy by Ben Jonson, and before I go into the discussion of this play, I will have a look at the summary and the main characters of the play. That will help us understand Dryden's discussion of the play. Okay, I am enlarging it. Alright. So Epicene or The Silent Woman, also known as Epicene, is a comedy by Ben Jonson. The play is about a man named Dauphin who creates a scheme to get his inheritance from his uncle Morose. The plan involves setting Morose up to marry Epicene, a boy disguised as a woman. It was originally performed by the Blackfriars Children or Children of the Queen's Revels, a group of boy players in 1609. So here we have a comic plot that this gentleman Dauphin wants to get the inheritance of his uncle Morose, who is not married. So he plans to give his uncle in marriage with a woman, but he does not want him to actually marry anybody, because in that case the woman might claim the property. So he presents a boy in the guise of a woman and tells him not to speak, because if he speaks then he will be caught as being a boy and not a woman. Therefore this boy remains silent throughout, so he is called a silent woman, and this leads to many funny and humorous situations. So here are the characters. Morose, a gentleman who loves silence. Sir Dauphin Eugenie, a knight, Morose's nephew. Ned Clermont, a gentleman, Dauphin's friend. True Wit, Dauphin's other friend. Epicene, a young gentlewoman, supposedly the silent woman, but actually is a boy. Sir John Law, a knight, Epicine's servant. Sir Amorous La Fool, another knight. Thomas Otter, a land and sea captain. Cutbeard, a barber, also aids in tricking Morose. Mute, one of the servants. Madame Hottie, Madame Centaur, Mistress Mavis, Mistress Trusty, Mistress Otter, the captain's wife. Person, pages, servants, plot. Now here is the plot. The play takes place in London, primarily in the home of Morose. Morose is a wealthy old man with an obsessive hatred of noise, going as far as to live on a street too narrow for carts to pass and make noise. So he is looking for silence. He has made plans to disinherit his nephew Dauphin by marrying. This is due to the schemes and tricks Dauphin has played on him in the past. To combat this, Dauphin concocts a plan with Cutbeard, Morose's barber. Cutbeard presents Morose with a young and supposedly silent woman to marry. Now, as you know, that there is a kind of wit here also, because it is very difficult to find a silent woman. Women are not usually silent, and that is what Morose was looking for. So they provide him with a silent woman. meets Epicene, he tries to find out if she is really a silent woman, testing her obedience. He tells her not to succumb to the temptations of the court and tells her about the virtues of silence. Under the assumption that his fiancée Epicene is an exceptionally quiet woman, Morose excitedly plans their marriage. Unbeknownst to him, Dauphin has arranged the whole match for purposes of his own. So Ben Jonson's comedies are mostly like this, that there are intrigues, there are plots, there are attempts of people to cheat other people, and so on. At the same time, there is an alliance of women with intellectual pretensions called the Ladies Collegiates. They are married women who live away from their husbands and speak their minds. They talk about how women can use sex to control their husbands. True Wit, hoping to secure his friend's inheritance, attempts to persuade Morose that marriage would not be good for him. True Wit says that no matter what, Morose will find himself unhappy in marriage, regardless of whether she is pretty, ugly, rich, poor, or even if Morose loves her. True Wit tells Morose that it is not the woman's fault, all of them are corrupted. He also tells Morose to kill himself instead of getting married. The couple are married despite the well-meaning interference of True Wit. Morose soon regrets his wedding day, as his house is inherited by a charivari consisting of Dauphin, True Wit and Clermont. Charivari meant a kind of procession or kind of demonstration of people coming in a group to mock those who have recently married. A bear warden named Otter and his wife, two stupid knights, and an assortment of collegiates. The house is overrun with noise and clamour, much to Morose's chagrin. Worse for Morose, Epicene quickly reveals herself to be a loud, nagging maid. Right. So Morose wants a divorce and consults two lawyers who are actually Dauphin's friends Cutbeard and Otter in disguise. But they can find no grounds for ending the match. Finally, Dauphin promises to reveal grounds to end the marriage if Morose agrees to give him his inheritance. The agreement made, Dauphin strips the female costume from Epicene, revealing that Morose's wife is in fact a boy, and therefore their marriage cannot be upheld. Morose is dismissed harshly, and the other ludicrous characters are discomfited by this revelation. So this is the story, and this is a comedy for which Jonson was famous for this kind of comedy. And now let us come to Dryden's discussion of the play. Now I told you that I would summarize the discussion, but I didn't find time for making any summary. To begin with the length of the action, it is so far from exceeding the compass of a natural day that it takes not up an artificial one. It is all included in the limits of 3 hours and a half. So the natural compass of a day was 24 hours and the artificial compass of a day was 12 hours. But the play is even shorter. The duration of the play is only 3 hours, the actual time for representing it on the stage. A beauty perhaps not much observed. If it had, we should not have looked on the Spanish translation of 5 hours with so much wonder. The scene of it is laid in London. So what is the beauty? The shortness of time. Actual time of the play is the same with the fictitious time of the action. The scene is in London. The latitude of place is almost as little as you can imagine, for it lies all within the compass of 2 houses and after the first act in one. So extreme maintenance of unity of time and place. The place is only 2 houses and finally one. The continuity of scenes is observed more than in any of our plays except in his own fox and alchemist. So what Corneille calls liaison de scène, the link of scenes or continuity of scenes. Dryden Johnson perfects it in his play The Alchemist and Volpone the Fox, and also here in this play. They are not broken above twice or thrice at most in the whole comedy. That is, change of scene is not more than 2 or 3 times. And in the two best of Corneille's plays, The Cid and Cinna, they are interrupted once. So that is the best example of neoclassical comedy or neoclassical drama where scenes are not broken. These two plays by Corneille, both very famous plays, Cid and Cinna. The action of the play is entirely one, the end or aim of which is the settling of Moroz's estate on Dauphine. So there is only one plot. By action, Dryden means plot. There is no subplot. At first, Moroz or an old man to whom all noise but his own talking is offensive. Some who would be thought critics say this humor of his is forced, but to remove that objection, we may consider him first to be naturally of a delicate hearing, as many are to whom all sharp sounds are unpleasant, and secondly, we may attribute much of it to the peevishness of his age or the wayward authority of an old man in his own house, where he may make himself obeyed. And to this the poet seems to allude in his name, Moroz. So, Dryden says that we need not criticize this peculiar humor in the sense, characteristic feature of one's character, that Moroz does not like any sound. He cannot bear any sound. He says that there are old men who have delicate ears who cannot bear noise. Besides this, I am assured from diverse persons that Ben Jonson was actually acquainted with such a man, one altogether as ridiculous as he is here represented. Now, this theory has already been rejected. So previously it was thought that there was a contemporary man, Dryden's contemporary, Ben Jonson's contemporary, who was the model. But later critics rejected this idea. It must be common to more, and the more common the more natural. To prove this they instance the best of comical characters, Falstaff. There are many men resembling him, old, fat, merry, cowardly, drunken, amorous, vain and lying. But to convince these people I need but tell them that humor is the ridiculous extravagance of conversation wherein one man differs from all others. So the argument that this characteristic feature was only that of Moroz and cannot be found in others, that argument Dryden says is not acceptable because many of the characters in comedy, they represent features that we also see in society. And he gives the example of the comic character Falstaff in Shakespeare, old, fat, merry, cowardly, drunken character. He says that many such characters can be found in society. And then he says that humor is an extravagance, that is like in modern cartoons, some characteristic feature is exaggerated. Similarly, in comedy of humor, one particular characteristic feature was exaggerated. So Dryden says that it would be an exaggeration, and that is acceptable in comedy. As for Falstaff, he is not properly one humor but a miscellany of humors or images drawn from so many several men that wherein he is singular is his wit, or those things he says, frater expectatum, unexpected by the audience. So Dryden makes a point here that there may be similar features among men like many men could be old, fat, round, drunken, cowardly like Falstaff, but they cannot speak like Falstaff. So by assigning a particular kind of speech to the character, the dramatist makes it unique. His quick evasions when you imagine him surprised, which as they are extremely diverting of themselves, so receive a great addition from his person. For the very sight of such an unwieldy old debauched fellow is a comedy alone. So Dryden praises Shakespeare in creating the character Falstaff by saying that even his physical features would make people laugh. So he is a correct or a right character for comedy. And here, having a place so proper for it, I cannot but enlarge somewhat upon the subject of humor, into which I am fallen. So he now discusses the theory of humor, which was a popular theory in the Renaissance. You perhaps know that the theory was derived from the medical theory of the Greek Dr. Galen, according to which there are 4 humors in the human body, and if any of those 4 humors increased in proportion to the others, then that person will have an exaggeration or an excessive character, excessive nature in that particular emotion. So blood, flame, black bile and yellow bile, these were the 4 humors. Now humors are liquids, as you can see. It is a medical theory. So one who would have too much of blood would be sanguinary. One who would have too much of flame would be a phlegmatic person. One who would have too much of black bile would be a melancholic person, and too much of yellow bile would make one a choleric person. So these are the 4 humors which were described in detail, and on that different kinds of persons were imagined, and this was used in drama for creating character. Now Dryden gives an explanation of this theory of humor also based upon Aristotle's discussion of ethos and pathos, 2 terms. Ethos means character or disposition, pathos means emotion or transient passion. And one may see that in comedy, ethos or character becomes important, and in tragedy, pathos or passions, emotions become important. Thus, when you see Socrates brought up on the stage, you are not to imagine him made ridiculous by the imitation of his actions, but rather by making him perform something very unlike himself, something so childish and absurd as by comparing it with the gravity of the true Socrates makes a ridiculous object for the spectators. So if you present a grave character like Socrates with some ridiculous feature, then it would create humor. In their new comedy which succeeded, the poets sought indeed to express the ethos, as in their tragedies, the pathos of mankind. So Dryden is referring to Greek comedy, which can be divided into 2 types, old comedy and new comedy. And in new comedy, Dryden says the poets used ethos and pathos. But this ethos contained only the general characters of men and manners, as old men, lovers, serving men, courtesans, parasites and such other persons, as we see in their comedies. So ethos meant general characters, and therefore already there was a basis for type characters when some general features were described. So old men, lovers, serving men, these are type characters. That is one old man or father, one lover, one courtesan, so like another, as if the first of them had begot the rest of every sort. So these were type characters and they were not individuated. So one old man would represent all old men and so on. Ex homine hum natum dicas. One the exact image of the other. This is a quotation from Terence's Eunuchus. The same custom they observed likewise in their tragedies. As for the French, though they have the word humor among them, yet they have small use of it in their comedies or farces. So humor, notice here with a French spelling. This French word also means humor, but the French dramatists do not make use of the theory of humor. They being but ill imitations of the ridiculum or that which stirred up laughter in the old comedy. But among the English it is otherwise, whereby humor is meant some extravagant habit, passion or affection, particular to some one person, by the oddness of which he is immediately distinguished from the rest of men. So Dryden says that in English comedy, humor does not mean a type character, it does not refer to type characters, but to a single individual who has some particular exaggerated feature, which being lively and naturally represented most frequently begets that malicious pleasure in the audience which is testified by laughter. So malicious pleasure, therefore it is an indication that all comedies were to some extent satirical. So by exposing the features, the exaggerated features of people, they satirized such features and people with such characteristics. So as Ben Jonson thought that comedies expose the vices of society, and that is why Ben Jonson in his plays mostly represents greedy people, legacy hunting, people trying to cheat others, trying to get inheritance by cheating people and so on. So exposure of vices of people, that was the purpose of comedy according to this theory. So laughter therefore here is malicious laughter. And the description of these humors drawn from the knowledge and observation of particular persons was the peculiar genius and talent of Ben Jonson. So in Ben Jonson's play, humor does not always represent type characters, but individual characters. Besides Morose, there are at least 9 or 10 different characters and humors in The Silent Woman, all which persons have several concernments of their own, yet are all used by the poet to the conducting of the main design to perfection. So the fact that there are a great number of characters does not mean that there is any lack of unity in the play. All the subsidiary characters also help the progression of the main action. I shall not waste time in commenting the writing of this play, but I will give you my opinion that there is more wit and acuteness of fancy in it than in any of Ben Jonson's. Here fancy means imagination. Besides that, he has here described the conversation of gentlemen in the persons of True Wit and his friends with more gaiety, air and freedom than in the rest of his comedies. So True Wit, who is a character in this play, The Silent Woman, and other gentlemen, through their conversation, Ben Jonson has depicted the fun and frolic of gentlemen or their manners. So as you know that comedy is also a comedy of manners. So in some way ethos also means manners, depiction of manners. For the contrivance of the plot is extreme elaborate and yet withal easy, elaborate yet simple. For the lucis or untying of it, it is so admirable that when it is done, no one of the audience would think the poet could have missed it. Lucis is the Greek term which means resolution or untying of the plot. Now, Dryden is actually using the phrase untying the knot, and in French this lucis is called denouement, which means untying of a knot. So Dryden praises the denouement of this play, the silent woman. And yet it was concealed so much before the last scene that any other way would sooner have entered into her thoughts. But I dare not take upon me to comment the fabric of it, because it is altogether so full of art that I must unravel every scene in it to comment it as I ought. And this excellent contrivance is still the more to be admired, because it is comedy where the persons are only of common rank and their business private, not elevated by passions or high concernments as in serious plays. The serious play means tragedy. So here characters are ordinary and their passions are ordinary. So they do not have high passions like in tragedy. Everyone here is proper judge of all he sees. Nothing is represented but that which he daily converses, so that by consequence all faults lie open to discovery and few are pardonable. So characters are depicted with their faults. It is this which Horace has judiciously observed. And then a quotation from Horace's Epistles. This line, it means, it is thought that comedy, drawing its themes from daily life, calls for less labor, but it calls proportionately for more as the indulgence allowed is less. So these lines of Horace's Epistles, these lines suggest that writing comedy is not easy. It also requires a lot of attention. But our poet, who was not ignorant of these difficulties, has made use of all advantages. He designs a large leap, takes his rise from the highest ground. So just as one who wants to leap, take a great leap, leaps from a tall building, similarly Johnson made use of all the advantages. One of the advantages is that which Corneille has laid down as the greatest which can arrive to any poem, and which he himself could never compass above thrice in all his plays, namely the making choice of some signal and long expected day whereon the action of the play is to depend. This day was that designed by Dauphin for the settling of his uncle's estate upon him. So Corneille had written that when the dramatist can single out one particular time or one particular day when the plot will be resolved, then it is a well-written comedy or well-written drama. And Corneille said that he could achieve this only 3 times in his dramatic career. And Dryden here says that Ben Jonson could do it properly here in this play. Here the day on which the question of the inheritance of Moroz's estate is resolved, on that day everything depends. This day was that designed by Dauphin for the settling of his estate upon him, which to compass he contrives to marry him. That the marriage had been plotted by him long beforehand is made evident by what he tells True Wit in the second act, that in one moment he had destroyed what he had been raising many months. Dauphin, fearing True Wit has wrecked his plans to hoodwink his uncle, exclaims, "That which I have plotted for and been maturing now these 4 months, you have blasted in a minute, now I am lost." So this is an indication that the settling of the property, Moroz's property upon Dauphin, it has been contrived for many months by Dauphin. There is another artifice of the poet which I cannot here omit, because by the frequent practice of it in his comedies, he has left it to us almost as a rule. That is, when he has any character or humour wherein he would show a coup de maître or his highest skill, he recommends it to your observation by a pleasant description of it before the person first appears. Thus in Bartholomew Fair he gives you the pictures of Nums and Cokes, and in this those of Daw, La Foule, Moroz and the collegiate ladies, all which you hear described before you see them, so that before they come upon the stage, you have a longing expectation of them, which prepares you to receive them favorably. And when they are there, even from their first appearance, you are so far acquainted with them that nothing of their humor is lost to you. So, the dramatist gives a prior description of the characters who are going to appear. This is another feature of this play, and therefore when the characters actually appear on the stage, then the audience already knows a lot about them and therefore can easily understand what is happening. Another point about this admirable plot: the business of it rises in every act. The second is greater than the first, the third than the second, and so forward to the fifth. There too you see till the very last scene new difficulties arising to obstruct the action of the play, which means that the plot has been conceived very well. In every act the plot becomes more and more complicated, and even in the last act there are some obstacles presented. So all these complications are resolved at the final denouement or lucis. But that the poet might entertain you with more variety all this while, he reserves some new characters to show you, which he opens not till the second and third act. So new characters appear in the different acts, thus adding variety to the play. In the second act, Morose, Daw, the barber and otter. In the third, the collegiate ladies, all which he moves afterwards in bywalks or underplots as diversions to the main design, lest it should grow tedious, though they are still naturally joined with it and somewhere or other subservient to it. Now, earlier Dryden said that this has one action only. Now he says that the subsidiary characters, they have some underplots. So this is perhaps not contradictory, because when Dryden said one action, he meant to say that one main action. But basically he wanted to praise the plot construction very highly. Thus, like a skillful chess player, by little and little he draws out his men and makes his pawns of use to greater persons. So all the subsidiary characters, they are also made use of by the dramatist. If this comedy and some others of his were translated into French prose, which is possible because Molière has written some comedies in prose, Molière has lately given them plays out of verse. Out of verse means in prose. I believe the controversy would soon be decided between the two nations, even making them the judges. So, if Ben Jonson's comedies or this particular comedy is translated into French prose, then the quarrel or the debate whether English plays are superior or French plays would be immediately resolved, meaning that this play is far superior to the French plays. But we need not call our hero to our aid, be it spoken to the honour of the English. Our nation can never want in any age such who are able to dispute the empire of wit with any people in the universe. So here we see a pride in the English nation, and Dryden says that we can contend with any wit in this world. And though the fury of a civil war and power for 20 years together abandoned to a barbarous race of men, enemies of all good learning, had buried the muses under the ruins of monarchy, yet with the restoration of our happiness, we see revived poesy lifting up its head and already shaking off the rubbish which lay so heavy on it. So here Dryden is speaking as a royalist, politically opposed to the Puritans, and says that even though for a number of years during the Commonwealth the theatre was banned and therefore all learning was also discouraged, but even then it could not be completely buried. We have seen since His Majesty's return many dramatic poems which yield not to those of any foreign nation, and which deserve all laurels but the English. So since the Restoration, His Majesty's return, that is Charles II came back to be the King of England. So since his return, many good plays have been constructed. We have seen since his, I will set aside flattery and envy. It cannot be denied, but we have had some little blemish, either in the plot or writing of all those plays which have been made within these 7 years. And perhaps there is no nation in the world so quick to discern them or so difficult to pardon them as ours. So Dryden says that the English are the greatest critics of the English dramatists. And in the last 7 years, it is true that some plays, some inferior plays were written, but it is us, the English critics, who have pointed this out. Yet if we can persuade ourselves to use the candor of that poet, who, though the most severe of critics, has left us this caution by which to moderate our censors, quoting from Horace, Ars Poetica, this line, ubi plura nitent in carmine non ego paucis offender maculis, means, when the beauties in a poem are numerous, I shall not take offense in a few. If there are numerous virtues in a poem, then I will not be offended by a few faults. If in consideration of their many and great beauties we can wink at some slight and little imperfections, if we, I say, can be thus equal to ourselves, I ask no favour from the French. So Dryden is boasting that we only have to equal ourselves. That is, we have had so many great writers, great dramatists like Shakespeare and Johnson. If we can write like them, then we will be, the best writers. And we need not even compare our work with the French. And if I do not venture upon any particular judgment of our late plays, it is out of consideration which the ancient writer gives me, vivorum ut magna admiratio, ita censura difficilis. This is from Veius Peterculus. Dryden often refers to this poet, and he gives the translation himself. Betwixt the extreme of admiration and malice, it is hard to judge uprightly of the living. We always tend to be either admire somebody extremely or be extremely malicious to any living person. Therefore, we cannot judge living writers correctly. Only I think it may be permitted me to say that as it is no lessening to us to yield to some plays, and those not many of our own nation in the last age, so can it be no addition to pronounce of our present poets that they have far surpassed all the ancients and the modern writers of other countries. So he says that if we yield to some plays, that is, if we accept that our plays are inferior to some other plays, including some plays of our own language, our own nation, then it is not much disparaging English writing. We may say that our poets have surpassed the past writers as well as modern writers of other countries. So in this expression, Dryden actually praises English writers and says that we are defeated, or we appear to be inferior only when compared with our own great writers. But compared to other writers of other nations, we have achieved a lot, or we are the best writers. Okay, so I am taking a 2 minutes break. In the meantime, you think if you have any question, I will come back immediately. Then this is what Dryden says, or Neander says, that this is what was spoken on that occasion, and Lycidaeus was going to reply to to Neander when he was prevented by Crates. I am confident, said he, that the most material things that can be said have been already urged on either side. If they have not, I must beg of Lycidaeus that he will defer his answer till another time. For I confess I have a joint quarrel to you both, because you have concluded, without any reason given for it, that rhyme is proper for the stage. So, Crates says that Lycidaeus need not give his response to Neander right now, but I have a quarrel with both of you, that is both Neander and Lycidaeus. You have said that rhyme is proper for drama. So here begins a discourse, we may say, or a discussion on whether rhyme is appropriate for drama or blank verse. Crates speaks against rhyme. According to him, rhyme is unnatural in the plays. Blank verse should be used, and the opposite in poetry. In poetry, rhyme should be used, blank verse should not be used. So that is the opinion of Crates. So let us see how this discussion unfolds. I will not dispute how ancient it has been among us to write this way. Perhaps our ancestors knew no better till Shakespeare's time. I will grant it was not altogether left by him, and that Fletcher and Ben Jonson used it frequently in their pastorals and sometimes in other plays. So even though rhyme has been used by our ancestors as well as Fletcher and Ben Jonson, further I will not argue whether we received it originally from our own countrymen or from the French, for that is an inquiry of as little benefit as theirs who in the midst of the late plague were not so solicitous to provide against it as to know whether we had it from the malignity of our own air or by transportation from Holland. So, according to Crates, use of rhyme in drama is like an infection. So in the case of the plague, we do not ask whether it came from Holland or it was there in our own native air. Similarly, it is useless to discuss whether we got rhyme from other nations or from our own ancestors. I have therefore only to affirm that it is not allowable in serious plays. Serious plays, tragedy or that kind of drama, their rhyme should not be used. For comedies, I find you already concluding with me. To prove this, I might satisfy myself to tell you how much in vain it is for you to strive against the stream of the people's inclination, the greatest part of which are prepossessed so much with those excellent plays of Shakespeare, Fletcher and Ben Jonson, which have been written out of rhyme, that except you could bring them such as were written better in it, and those too by persons of equal reputation with them, it will be impossible for you to gain your cause with them, who will still be judges. So people are biased by the plays of Shakespeare, Jonson and Fletcher, and the plays which were not written in rhyme, and therefore they won't accept anybody else to write in their manner, because they think that nobody can match these writers. This is to which, in fine, all your reasons must submit. The unanimous consent of an audience is so powerful that even Julius Caesar, as Macrobius reports of him, when he was perpetual dictator, was not able to balance it on the other side. But when Laberius, a Roman knight, at his request contended in the mime with another poet, he was forced to cry out, Etiam fabente me victus es Laberi. So the opinion of the masses or the opinion of the majority has such a great force that even a powerful tyrant like Julius Caesar, he could not help the fighter Laberius win, and he had to say cry out, despite my favoring you, Laberius, you have been overcome. This is a quotation from Macrobius's Saturnalia. But I will not on this occasion take the advantage of the greatest number, but only urge such reasons against rhyme as I find in the writings of those who have argued for the other way. So, Crates says that I will not argue that most people are against rhyme, that is why one should not use rhyme. But I will try to show that those who have used rhyme in drama, they have not excelled. First, then, I am of opinion that rhyme is unnatural in a play because dialogue there is presented as the effect of sudden thought. So, in a play, the dialogue should be natural because it should not appear to be premeditated. So, when two characters are meeting and speaking, their speech should be natural, and rhyme is not natural. So, rhyme always gives a sense of premeditation. For a play is the imitation of nature, and since no man without premeditation speaks in rhyme, neither ought he to do it on the stage. This hinders not, but the fancy may be there elevated to a higher pitch of thought than it is in ordinary discourse. So, rhyme will elevate the imagination to a higher level than plain speech without rhyme, but it is always premeditated, therefore it is unnatural in drama. For there is a probability that men of excellent and quick parts may speak noble things extempore, but those thoughts are never fettered with the numbers of sound of words without study, and therefore it cannot but be unnatural to present the most free way of speaking in that which is the most constrained. So, Crates says that it is possible that great men or very intelligent men, they can say something very witty and intelligent suddenly. Extempore means spontaneously, on the time. But it is very unlikely that this great witty statement would also be made in rhyme. So that would demand a lot of artificiality, which is not possible. For this reason, says Aristotle, it is best to write tragedy in that kind of verse which is the least such, or which is nearest prose. And this among the ancients was the iambic, and with us is blank verse, or the measure of verse kept exactly without rhyme. So Aristotle said that in tragedy that verse should be used which is nearest to our speech, and iambic was the meter which was closest to ordinary speech. For Latin poetry or Greek poetry, but for English it is blank verse which is closest to our speech, or any verse without rhyme. Now blank verse is iambic pentameter without rhyme. These numbers therefore are fittest for a play, the others for a paper of verses or a poem, blank verse being as much below them as rhyme is improper for the drama. So the numbers, that is meter, prosody like iambic, they are fit for poetry. And blank verse is much below them because it is without rhyme, and rhyme is improper for drama. And if it be objected that neither are blank verse made extempore, yet as nearer nature, they are still to be preferred. So one may argue that even blank verse is a meter, that is, it is iambic pentameter, it is not ordinary speech. but Crates says that even then it is preferable over rhymed. But there are two particular exceptions which many besides myself have had to verse. Two exceptions in verse, by which it will appear yet more plainly how improper it is in plays. And the first of them is grounded on that very reason for which some have commended rhyme. They say the quickness of repartees in argumentative scenes receives an ornament from verse. So when there is a repartee, that is witty competition in speech, then the quickness of repartee becomes more beautifully expressed when it is expressed in rhyme. Now what is more unreasonable than to imagine that a man should not only light upon the wit, but the rhyme too upon the sudden? This is the old argument that Dryden already used, that it is not improbable that very intelligent men would come upon some witty statement. But it is highly improbable that even though they come upon such statement extempore, all of a sudden, but they also couch that statement in rhyme. That is highly improbable. This nicking of him who spoke before both in sound and measure is so great an happiness that you must at least suppose the persons of your play to be born poets. So this would be a very fortunate accident if anybody can not only make a witty statement but also say that in rhyme, and then he must be a born poet. And Dryden quotes from Virgil's Eclogues, Arcades omnes et cantare pares et respondere parati. It means all Arcadians equally ready both to sing and to make reply. Virgil in his Eclogues, which is pastoral poetry, often represents shepherds engaging in witty competitions, and the shepherds also sing. So Crates suggests that these people must be as talented as the characters in Virgil's Eclogues in Arcadia. They must have arrived to the degree of quid conabar dicere. This means whatever I tried to express was poetry. So these people, they must be so talented as whatever they try to say is poetry. This is a quotation from Ovid's Tristia. It means whatever I tried to express was poetry. To make verses almost whether they will or no, if they are anything below this, it will look rather like the design of two than the answer of one. It will appear that your actors hold intelligence together, that they perform their tricks like fortune tellers by confederacy. So, as it happens in a repartee, when represented in a play, in the dialogue, the speech of one character is finished halfway the line, which is called a hemistiche. So if it is a hexameter, it is 6 feet, then after 3 feet the speech of the first character ends, and the next 3 feet of the same line is the speech of the second character. So if even though the line is divided into speeches of two characters, even then the line rhymes with the earlier line, then it would appear that these two characters are in a confederacy. That is, they have together designed this line so that it rhymes with the previous line. So it would not appear at all as natural. It would appear extremely artificial, as if the two speakers have decided beforehand how they are going to speak in such a manner that even though they are replying to one another and the speech of the first character ends in the middle of the sentence, even then the line will rhyme with the previous line. The hand of art will be too visible in it against that maxim of all professions, art est celare artem. a well-known Latin expression. It means art is concealing art. So if the poet shows his art or flaunts his art, then it is not true art. True art actually conceals art and appears to be natural. That it is the greatest perfection of art to keep itself undiscovered, nor will it serve you to object that however you manage it is still known to be a play, and consequently the dialogue of two persons understood to be the labor of one poet. So you may say that after all it is a poem written by one poet. For a play is still an imitation of nature. We know we are to be deceived and we desire to be so, but no man ever was deceived but with the probability of truth. For who will suffer a gross lie to be fastened on him? So, we may know that the play is written by one poet. We want to be deceived, thinking that the speeches are made by two different characters. But the deception should also be similar to reality. That is very similar. It must be very similar. It must resemble reality. Otherwise, nobody would be convinced by something which is grossly impossible or incredible. Thus, we sufficiently understand that the scenes which represent cities and countries to us are not really such, but only painted on boards and canvas. But shall that excuse the ill painter or designment on them? Nay, rather ought they not be laboured with so much the more diligence and exactness to help the imagination. So when there are painted scenes used in the theatre to represent different cities, one knows that they are painted scenes, but that does not mean that the painter would not take care to represent the scenes realistically, convincingly. Since the mind of man does naturally tend to truth, and therefore the nearer anything comes to the imitation of it, the more it pleases. So here Critias raises the issue of verisimilitude. So whatever is presented in poetry or in drama, it must be credible, it must be very similar, otherwise it will not be convincing. Thus you see your rhyme is incapable of expressing the greatest thoughts naturally, and the lowest it cannot with any grace. So rhyme cannot present high thoughts in a natural way, and the low thoughts are too low to be represented in poetry anyway. For what is more unbefitting the majesty of verse than to call a servant or bid a door to be shut in rhyme? So this is Critias' argument, to which later proper answer will be given by Neander. So Critias says that it is below the dignity of poetry that such lowly things or ordinary things like commanding a servant to shut the door, something like that should be spoken in rhyme. So it is below the dignity of poetry. Yet this argument, if granted, would only prove that we may write better in verse but not more naturally. So rhyme takes away the naturalness, the natural quality of artistic representation. So this portion or this speech by Critias on rhyme, it is actually an answer to Dryden's argument in Preface to the Rival Ladies, where he claimed that rhyme was superior to blank verse. So here Critias refutes that argument by saying that rhyme is unnatural in drama. Dryden had argued that rhyme was superior to blank verse. neither is it able to evince that, for he who wants judgment to confine his fancy in blank verse may want it as much in rhyme. So it is not only a question of high judgment of the poet. One who lacks judgment would write poor poetry both in blank verse and in rhyme. So just by rhyming, his poetry won't be any better. And he who has it will avoid errors in both kinds. So the poet who has judgment will write well in both. Therefore it is not an argument that rhyme in any way enhances the quality of poetry. Latin verse was as great a confinement to the imagination of those poets as rhyme to ours. And yet you find Ovid saying too much on every subject. So, Latin verse used a lot of rhetoric and prosody, and therefore it was quite difficult. Yet a poet like Ovid has a lot to say on every subject, so this difficulty was no difficulty for him. Nescivit quod bene cessit relinquere. This is, Critias says that Seneca tells it. Now there are two different Senecas. Dryden is quoting from the two of them, but he has kind of confused the two Senecas. This Latin sentence means he never knows how to give over when he had done well. This is a praise by Marcus Seneca, a praise of Ovid, of which he gives you one famous instance in his description of the deluge. Omnia pontus erat, de erant quoque littora pontu. This is a quotation from a different Seneca, Lucius Seneca. This line means, now all was sea, nor had that sea a shore. So this is a description of the ocean, of the flood in Ovid, and praised by Lucius Seneca. Thus Ovid's fancy was not limited by verse, and Virgil needed not verse to have bounded his. So neither Ovid nor Virgil found it difficult to write in verse. In our own language, we see Ben Jonson confining himself to what ought to be said, even in the liberty of blank verse. And yet, Corneille, the most judicious of the French poets, is still varying the same sense in 100 ways and dwelling eternally on the same subject, though confined by rhyme. So, blank verse is easier to write because it does not have rhyme. It has some liberty, some freedom. Yet Ben Jonson does not vary his subject. He writes on the same thing. He does not vary, even though he has the freedom, because he is writing in blank verse. Corneille, on the other hand, writes in rhyme, which is confining, which is difficult. Yet Corneille varies his subject in infinite ways. Therefore, the point is not that rhyme presents any kind of difficulty to the poet, or blank verse gives him any freedom. It depends upon how the poet wants to use these devices. Some other exceptions I have to verse, but since these I have named are for the most part already public, I conceive it reasonable they should first be answered. This is actually an allusion to the debate that was going on between Dryden and his brother-in-law Robert Howard. Dryden also wrote a number of plays with Howard, which were in rhyme. It is an explicit confession that Dryden has been adhering to Howard's previously published views. Then Critias stops and Neander begins his response. It concerns me less than any, said Neander, saying he had ended, to reply to this discourse. because when I should have proved that verse may be natural in place, yet I should always be ready to confess that those which I have written in this kind come short of that perfection which is required. Yet since you are pleased I should undertake this province, I will do it, though with all imaginable respect and deference, both to that person from whom you have borrowed your strongest arguments, and to whose judgment when I have said all, I finally submit. So the person referred to here could be Howard, from whom Critias is borrowing these arguments, or it may be Aristotle also. But before I proceed to answer your objections, I must first remember you. Remember you means remind you that I exclude all comedy from my defense, and next that I deny not, but blank verse may be also used, and content myself only to assert that in serious plays where the subject and characters are great and the plot unmixed with mirth, which might allay or divert these concernments which have produced, rhyme is there as natural and more effectual than blank verse. So first Neander says, okay, I admit that blank verse can also be used in drama, but in great plays and serious plays, that is in tragedy, where the characters are of high origin, noble origin, and the highest kind of speeches are expected from them, their rhyme is natural, because there the speeches will be highly exalted, and therefore rhyme is natural. And now, having laid down this as a foundation to begin with Critias, I must crave leave to tell him that some of his arguments against rhyme reach no farther than from the faults or defects of ill rhyme, to conclude against the use of it in general. So some people have not been able to use rhyme properly. So they have used rhyme in an ill manner, and that is the ground of Critias' object. May not I conclude against blank verse by the same reason? So if we accept that, then I can also say that some people could not use blank verse properly, therefore blank verse should not be used. If the words of some poets who write in it are either ill-chosen or ill-placed, shall I for their vicious affectation condemn those excellent lines of Fletcher which are written in that kind? So if other poets cannot write properly or rhyme improperly, won't I praise Fletcher when he rhymes extremely well? Is there anything in rhyme more constrained than this line in blank verse? Then here is a proposed line, apparently a quotation that Neander quotes from some poor writer, inferior writer. But actually nobody wrote this line. It is totally made up. I heaven invoke and strong resistance make. So Neander says that this is an example of blank verse, and is it not a very poor writing, where you see both the clauses are placed unnaturally, that is, both the clauses are inversed, therefore it is not good. That is contrary to the common way of speaking, and that without the excuse of a rhyme to cause it. Yet you would think me very ridiculous if I should accuse the stubbornness of blank verse for this, and not rather the stiffness of the poet. So this line is not written well, and should I blame the blank verse for it, because it is written in blank verse, or should I blame the poet? The poet is stiff, he cannot write well. So should I blame the poet or should I blame the blank verse? Therefore, Critias, you must either prove that words, though well chosen and duly placed, yet render not rhyme natural in itself, or that however natural and easy the rhyme may be, yet it is not proper for a play. So if you are arguing against rhyme, you have to say that even when words are properly chosen, even then rhyme is not good, or that rhyme is not natural. or that even if rhyme is used naturally, even then it is not proper for drama. So we have to prove that. If you insist on the former part, I would ask you, what other conditions are required to make rhymes natural in itself, besides an election of apt words and a right disposition of them? So if you say that even though words are properly chosen, rhyme is not good, then I would object that then when will rhyme become good? Even if the words are correctly chosen, properly disposed, then rhyme is not good, then when will rhyme be good? So this argument will not hold. For the due choice of your words express your sense naturally, and the due placing them adapts rhyme to it. If you object that one verse may be made for the sake of another, though both the words and rhyme be apt, I answer it cannot possibly so fall out. For either there is a dependence of sense between the first line and the second, or there is none. So, if you say that sometimes poets use right lines just for the sake of rhyme, and the lines are not apt, then I would say that there is no such dependence. If the words are in a natural position, then they are natural and they have proper sense. If there be no dependence, yet still the due order of words makes the last line as natural in itself as the other, so that the necessity of a rhyme never forces any but bad or lazy writers to say what they would not otherwise. So, one line that comes after another line, they should be linked by way of natural reason and not for the sake of rhyme. So only lazy writers write for the sake of rhyme. And then he explains this notion of repartee or quick answering, quick response in drama, where in the middle of a sentence one speech ends and the speech of another character begins, and the middle of a sentence in a verse is called hemistiche. So as I gave you the example that if it is written in hexameter, that is 6 feet meter, then after 3 feet the first hemistiche ends and the second 3 feet are the second hemistiche. Many times the close of the sentence falls into the middle of the next verse or farther off, and he may often prevail himself of the same advantages in English which Virgil had in Latin. He may break off in the hemistiche and begin another line. Indeed, the not observing these two last things makes plays which are writ in verse so tedious, for though most commonly the sense is to be confined to the couplet, yet nothing that does perpetuo tenore fluere run in the same channel can please always. So, sometimes it is important to break a line in the middle and begin a new line after a hemistiche, so that when the sense ends, the perpetual continuation of meaning or perpetual flow of sense that is not disturbed. So the point here is that in a couplet the sense always ends at the end of the line, but at other places sometimes it may become necessary to end the sense in the middle of a line. It is like murmuring of a stream which, not varying in the fall, causes at first attention, at last drowsiness. So perpetuo tenore fluere is a quotation from Cicero's Orator. So if there is no break in the middle of a line but there is perpetual flow, then the verse becomes like music. It becomes a continuous cadence, a continuous flow, and it would provoke drowsiness. It would induce sleep. It is like the murmuring of a stream which, not varying in the fall, causes at first attention, at last drowsiness. So, like the sound of a waterfall, continuous sound. At first you are attentive to it, but later you tend to fall asleep. Variety of cadences is the best rule, the greatest help to the actors and refreshment to the audience. Therefore, varying the sound by breaking a sentence in the middle helps to keep the audience alert and attentive. If then verse may be made natural in itself, how becomes it unnatural in a play? So, verse therefore cannot be unnatural. You say the stage is the representation of nature and no man in ordinary conversation speaks in rhyme. But you foresaw when you said this that it might be answered. Neither does any man speak in blank verse or in measure without rhyme. So, as I told you, Neander here replies or refutes the arguments given by Crates against rhyme and says that if you say that rhyme is unnatural and therefore it is not acceptable in drama, then blank verse is also unnatural, because blank verse is not ordinary speech, it is iambic pentameter. So in real life, who speaks in iambic pentameter? Therefore it is unnatural. Therefore you concluded that which is nearest nature is still to be preferred, but you took no notice that rhyme might be made as natural as blank verse by the well placing of the words. So whether it is rhyme or it is blank verse, if the poet can place the words properly, then it becomes natural. And all the difference between them when they are both correct is the sound in one which the other wants. So in rhyme there is the consonance of sounds which is lacking in blank verse. That is the only difference. And if so, the sweetness of it and all the advantage resulting from it which are handled in the preface to the rival ladies will yet stand good. So as I told you that Crates' speech was a refutation of Dryden's argument in favor of rhyme in the preface to the rival ladies, and here Neander or Dryden refers to it. As for that place of Aristotle where he says plays should be written in that kind of verse which is nearest prose, it makes little for you, blank verse being properly but measured prose. So blank verse is measured prose. It has meter, so it is measured. It is prose because it does not have rhyme. So if you use blank verse, then also you are following Aristotle. Now measure alone in any modern language does not constitute verse. Those of the ancients in Greek and Latin consisted in quantity of words and a determinate number of feet. But when by the inundation of the Goths and Vandals into Italy, new languages were introduced and barbarously mingled with the Latin, of which Italians, Spanish, French and ours are dialects, a new way of poesy was practiced. So Dryden here goes to some philological discussion of the history of language, and he says that in ancient Greek and Latin languages, poetry was quantitative, that is quantity of words and number of feet, these were all taken into consideration in prosody. But when Latin was corrupted, when the Roman Empire was invaded by Goths and Vandals, then Latin was corrupted and a new kind of poetry began to be written. So the vernacular poetry, which was in English at least, it was accented poetry, and the ancient Greek and Latin poetry was quantitative poetry. So poetry in all European vernaculars were different kinds of poetry, different from ancient literature. But as Dryden asserts that Italian, Spanish, French and English, they are dialects of Latin. Now notice that English is by no means a dialect of Latin. But Dryden takes great pride, thinking that much of English is, many English words have their roots in Latin words. Now the reason of that is the borrowing from French. So French words are from Latin words. English is a mix of French and Teutonic languages, that is Germanic languages, which Dryden mentions, made out of them and the Teutonic. But he calls English a dialect of Latin, which is kind of exaggeration. But he says that these languages, they are, at least they are closer to Latin. However, a new kind of poetry was practiced, I say in those countries, for in all probability it was that of the conquerors in their own nations, that is the Goths and Vandals. At least we are able to prove that the Eastern people have used it from all antiquity. Vid Daniel his defense of rhyme. Vid means see. So here Dryden is referring to a book called The Defense of Rhyme by Daniel. It was published in 1603 in reply to Campion's Art of English Poesy. And in this book Daniel speaks of rhyme being used by Turks and Arabs. So here Dryden refers to the Eastern people, that is the Turks and Arabs, who have used it from ancient times. This new way consisted in measure or number of feet and rhyme. So the new kind of poetry used rhyme. Feet and number of feet and rhyme, these were the two ingredients of this new kind of poetry. The sweetness of rhyme and observation of accent supplying the place of quantity in words, which could neither exactly be observed by those barbarians who knew not the rules of it, neither was it suitable to their tongues as it had been to the Greek and Latin. So the Goths and Vandals, they could not use quantitative verse. They did not know it, their languages also did not allow it. Milton uses the same argument in the preface to Samson Agonistes, where he says that a rhyme is a barbaric invention. And Milton does not use rhyme. Milton uses blank verse, as you all know. Dryden, on the other hand, even though he talks about the origin of rhyme in the barbaric invention, barbaric invasion of the Roman Empire, he does not say that rhyme itself is barbaric. On the other hand, he praises rhyme. So there is a great difference in the attitudes of Dryden and Milton on the question of rhyme. No man is tried in modern poesy to observe any further rule in the feet of his verse, but that they be syllables, that is, 2 syllables. Whether spondy, trochee or iambic, it matters not. Only he is obliged to rhyme. So the quantitative prosody, the quantitative measuring of verse has come down to this simplicity in modern languages, that the words are mostly disyllabic, that is, there are 2 syllables, on the basis of which we have these meters, spondy, trochee and iambic. All these meters have 2 syllables. Now Dryden does not mention the trisyllabic meters. Only he is obliged to rhyme. Neither do the Spanish, French, Italian or Germans acknowledge at all, or very rarely, any such kind of poesy as blank verse amongst them. So these other languages, European languages, they do not acknowledge blank verse. Only the English speak of blank verse. Blank verse is iambic pentameter. Therefore, at most it is but a poetic prose, a sermo pedestris, and as such most fit for comedies, where I acknowledge rhyme to be improper. Now here you see Dryden or Neander is making a distinction. He is in favor of using rhyme in drama, But he says that in comedy it is improper. In comedy, plain prose is more suitable because the characters are ordinary. Whereas in tragedy, the characters are of noble origin, so they are witty and their speeches are elegant, so they can use rhyme. Therefore, at most it is but a poetic prose or psalmopedestres. Further, as to that quotation of Aristotle, our couplet verses may be rendered as near prose as blank verse itself, by using those advantages I lately named as breaks in an hemistiche, or running the sense into another line, thereby making art and order appear as loose and free as nature. So that is, Dryden suggests that blank verse could also be, he suggests that rhyme could also be made appear to be natural, like blank verse, if one breaks a line into two at the hemistiche, if one breaks the sense, or if one uses run-on lines, that is, the sense does not end at the end of a line but continues in the next line. So it will appear to be more natural. Or not tying ourselves to couplets strictly, we may use the benefit of the Pindaric way practiced in the Seas of Rhodes. So couplets are the kinds of verse where sense must complete itself at the end of the line. Therefore, couplets are very artificial. So Dryden says that we can also try to use Pindaric verse as in the Seas of Rhodes. The Seas of Rhodes was the first English opera where the numbers vary and the rhymes is disposed carelessly and far from often chiding. So there is a lot of liberty both with numbers and with rhyme in the Seas of Rhodes. And far from neither is that other advantage of the ancients to be despised of changing the kind of verse when they please with the change of the scene or some new entrance. Now this is something we find happening quite frequently, in Shakespeare's comedies, Measure for Measure or other comedies, where we see that according to scene, some scenes are in rhyme, some other scenes are in continuous prose. For they confine not themselves always to iambics, but extend their liberty to all lyric numbers and sometimes even to hexameter. The ancients use different meters and different kinds of prosody, iambic, hexameter and other numbers. But I need not go so far to prove that rhyme, as it succeeds to all other offices of Greek and Latin verse, so especially to this of plays, since the custom of nations at this day confirms it. The French, Italian and Spanish tragedies are generally written in it, and sure the universal consent of the most civilized parts of the world ought in this, as it doth in other customs, to include the rest. So Neander says that I do not have to argue much to prove that rhyme is accepted everywhere in all European countries. Most plays are written in rhyme, therefore it is the custom of the civilized world. Right, so I will stop here. If you have any questions, you can ask.